Welcome to Mr. Sleepless Horror. Let's listen to horror stories to fall asleep with gentle rain sounds. I still remember the strange heaviness of that morning, the way the air felt too still for early autumn in northern Arizona. I had camped alone dozens of times before, always chasing quiet places where cell service died and the world felt paused. But that morning, as I stepped out of my tent and saw the long shadows stretching unnaturally far across the hard ground, something inside me tightened. It felt like waking up in a place that was almost familiar, but shifted a few inches off from the world I knew. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the long drive from Flagstaff had worn me down, but the feeling clung to me like the desert dust on my boots. The campsite was deep inside a lesser-used area of Coconino National Forest. I had picked it precisely because people rarely went that far from the marked trails. I liked the feeling of isolation, the sense that every sound and shape belonged to the land rather than to the chaos of crowds. The site rested near a dried riverbed, the kind where the earth sank and cracked in jagged patterns that looked like old scars. The night before had been calm, the sky clear enough to see the Milky Way stretching across the black. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. But as I brewed coffee that morning, I couldn't ignore the low, subtle throb of discomfort sitting just beneath my ribs. I walked the perimeter of my site, a habit I had picked up after running into a bear years back in Colorado. No prints, no droppings, no sign of anything wandering through the night. Yet the ground felt slightly different under my boots, softer, as if something had disturbed it just beneath the surface. I crouched, pressed down with my fingers, and felt the faintest give, almost like a shallow pocket of air was trapped beneath the dirt. I pulled my hand back quickly, annoyed at myself for reacting as though I had touched something alive. I told myself the soil probably shifted from old burrows or dried water channels. But the unease stayed. I packed a small day bag and decided to hike toward a rock outcrop I had noticed the evening before. The walk wasn't long, maybe 40 minutes, but the whole time I kept hearing small, quick sounds behind me. Not footsteps, more like brief taps, as if something light struck the ground and then vanished. Each time I turned, the forest stood still, thin branches barely moving in the faint breeze. The sun climbed higher, the heat rising off the ground in wavering lines, and for a while the anxiety faded beneath the heavy quiet. But when I reached the rocks and sat down to drink some water, I noticed something strange. Below the outcrop, near a cluster of scrub oak, there were drag marks in the dirt. Faint, but long, like something had been pulled several feet. I scanned the area, expecting to see a lost tarp or a piece of equipment someone had dropped. Nothing. The marks ended abruptly near a patch of shattered twigs. No prints. No sign of wildlife struggling or feeding. Just that long, silent trail cut through the dust. I felt my throat tighten as I realized the smoothness of the drag pattern didn't look like an animal. It looked like something human weight would make, but without the shifting impressions of feet. I tried to convince myself it was none of my business and headed back. The return hike felt longer, the trees more closely packed, the light harsher. Every sound, even a bird fluttering away, made me flinch. When I reached the site, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not strong, just a faint metallic tang, like old blood on rusty tools. It disappeared with the next breeze, leaving me wondering whether I imagined it. My tent looked untouched, my gear exactly where I left it. But one thing was wrong. My cooler had shifted about 2 feet from its original spot. Not toppled, not opened, just moved, as if someone had gripped one corner and dragged it an arm's length. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize what I saw. The ground wasn't angled enough for it to slide. No wind could budge it. No animal would drag something without trying to open it. I felt that same sinking sensation inside me, the one I'd felt touching the soft patch of dirt earlier, a warning I didn't yet understand. By late afternoon, I decided I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to rush packing and drive out tired, but I also didn't want to stay another full day. I avoided hiking again, choosing instead to sit near the fire pit and read. But my eyes kept drifting to the tree line. The silence grew heavier as the sun dipped, like the forest was holding its breath. Around dusk, I heard the first sound that truly scared me. A single, sharp exhale from somewhere behind my tent. Not an animal grunt. Not a cough. More like someone trying to keep quiet and failing for half a second. I froze, listening, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might draw attention. The exhale didn't repeat. I waited several long minutes before forcing myself to stand, pretending I hadn't heard anything. I kept the fire small but steady and stayed close to it, wishing I had cell service. As the sky turned dark and the fire cast long, trembling shadows on the ground, the forest began to creak and shift with the cooling air. Normally I found comfort in those nighttime sounds, but tonight every noise pressed against me like a warning. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it closed, the thin nylon felt like a pathetic barrier. I lay still, listening to the wind, the distant rustle of branches, the occasional thump of something dropping from a tree. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, jolting awake each time a sound grew too sharp. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a rhythmic pressure beneath my sleeping pad. A very faint push upward, then another. Slow, spaced out, deliberate. My body went rigid. I held my breath, feeling the soft but undeniable movement beneath me. It wasn't the shifting of soil or roots. It felt like something testing the ground from below. I slid off the pad as quietly as I could, pressing myself against the side of the tent. The pressure continued for another few minutes, then stopped. I waited, trembling, afraid to move or make a sound. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to sit upright and unzip the door just enough to peer outside. The campsite was empty, still, but the ground directly beneath where I had lain looked slightly raised, only by an inch or two, like something had pushed up the dirt and let it settle again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up until dawn, hand on my pocket knife, listening to every shift of the wind. The moment sunlight hit the trees, I began to pack. As I loaded the last of my gear into the car, something caught my eye near the dried riverbed. A straight line carved into the dirt. Fresh. Smooth. The same kind of mark I had seen near the scrub oak. But this one ended only a few feet from where my tent had been, stopping in a shallow impression shaped almost exactly like the outline of a human shoulder. I drove away fast, too afraid to look back. But the thing that haunts me most isn't the drag marks or the pressure under my sleeping pad. It's the memory of that metallic smell returning just as I closed my car door, and realizing as the wind shifted that it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the disturbed patch of dirt beneath where I had slept, rising in slow, warm breaths as if something down there finally knew I was leaving. I think the memory that still wakes me most nights is the way the gravel crunched under the tires when I pulled into that remote Nevada campground, like the sound was warning me not to stay. It was late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the bare hills, spreading long streaks of reddish light across the sand. I had planned the trip as a reset after a brutal stretch of work in Reno, just 2 nights alone to clear my head before starting a new job. The campground sat miles off a service road, tucked against the base of a ridge that looked carved out by old winds. Nothing around it except open land, scattered sagebrush, and stretches of silence, so deep they felt like physical weight. I set up my small tent beside a weathered picnic table, grateful for the breeze moving over the desert floor. The air smelled dry and ancient, like the world had stopped aging here a long time ago. A few other sites sat empty nearby, each one marked by faded wooden posts and scorched fire rings. The isolation didn't bother me. I wanted quiet. I wanted space to breathe. But under that sky and the long, thin shadows of the ridge, I kept feeling as if someone else had arrived just before me and stepped out of sight. I walked a few minutes up the slope behind my site to get a view of the basin. From the top, the land stretched in every direction, pale and open under the fading sun. No cars, no trails, no sign of movement, but there was an odd, squared-off patch of earth near the far edge of the campground, as if someone had dug a shallow trench and then poorly filled it in. The dirt there looked a shade darker than the rest. I told myself it was probably an old utility pit or something the park staff had worked on, but something about its straight shape bothered me. Too neat, too deliberate, too close. The evening cooled fast, the desert dropping temperature like a switch flipping. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal, letting the crackle of burning twigs settle my nerves. Every so often I glanced toward the empty sites, expecting to see headlights or hear someone pulling in. But the campground stayed silent, the kind of silence that made even my own breathing sound loud. Then, just as the sky turned deep blue, I saw a flicker of movement along the ridge. A single shape, quick and narrow, slipping behind a large boulder. I stood, heart thudding, scanning the hillside. Nothing. Maybe a deer, I told myself, though I hadn't seen tracks or droppings on the climb earlier. Still, animals wandered everywhere out here. That made sense. I tried to settle in for the night, reading by lantern light, but I couldn't stop thinking about that motion on the ridge. The longer I sat, the more I became aware of how exposed everything felt. No trees, no cover, just my small tent and the open desert stretching from horizon to horizon. The wind picked up after dark, carrying dry grit that hissed lightly against the nylon walls. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening as the fire faded to embers. Before long, I drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, the kind where your mind never fully shuts down. Sometime after midnight, I snapped awake to the faintest scrape outside the tent. Not the wind, not an animal, something slower, measured, like a shoe brushing against sand. I held still, straining to hear past the rush of my own pulse. Another scrape, closer this time. A soft thud. My mouth went dry. I reached silently for the small flashlight beside my bag, but didn't turn it on. The sound circled the tent in irregular, dragging steps. Whoever or whatever it was didn't seem in a hurry. They moved like they were learning the shape of the place, or maybe testing the distance between objects. The footsteps stopped near the zipper entrance. I held my breath, counting, waiting for some sign of intention. Nothing. No breathing. No weight shifting. Just stillness pressed so tight against the tent wall that I could feel it in my bones. My mind raced with possibilities. A hiker lost in the dark. A drunk driver who wandered from the road. Someone camping illegally and curious about me. None of those explanations felt right. Something about the slowness of the steps and the lack of light or voice or any normal human signal made my skin crawl. After several minutes the steps moved again, this time drifting toward the table. I heard the faint sound of metal tapping wood. My mess kit. Something picked it up or nudged it. The tap repeated, slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the weight or examining the edge. Then silence. Heavy, thick silence that seemed to stretch out for hours. I waited, barely breathing, until exhaustion finally forced me to lie down again. Even then I kept my eyes open, watching the faint glow of the moon through the fabric. At some point I fell asleep, though it couldn't have been for long. A sharp, metallic clink jolted me awake again. Outside, near the fire ring, something was being moved. I unzipped the tent a couple inches and peered out. The night was almost pitch black except for the dull shape of the ridge against the sky. But I could see that my camp chair had been shifted several feet to the left. Not knocked over. Placed. As if someone had picked it up, set it down purposefully, and then walked away. I considered packing up right then and driving off, but the idea of stepping outside while someone might be standing just beyond the circle of darkness froze me in place. I waited for dawn, counting the minutes until the sky lightened enough for me to see clearly. When it did, I crawled out slowly, every muscle tense. The site looked untouched except for the chair. But when I walked toward it, I saw narrow marks in the dirt around the legs. Shoe impressions, maybe, though they were faint and blurred. But one thing stood out immediately. The impressions were extremely close together, like the person who made them stood almost perfectly still for a long time. I forced myself to pack as the sun rose, folding and stuffing everything with shaky hands. When I went to break down the tent, I noticed something behind it. A single strip of torn fabric lying in the sand. Dark gray. Not from my gear. Not from any equipment I recognized. I loaded the car and took one last look around the campground. The wind swept across the basin, lifting small spirals of grit. Everything looked ordinary in the daylight, almost peaceful. But then I noticed the squared-off patch of earth again. And this time, from the right angle, I could see it wasn't just a filled trench. It had once been opened more recently. The darker soil indicated fresh disturbance. A lot of it, enough that whatever had been buried there had been uncovered, and then covered again not long before I arrived. My stomach twisted. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. I got into the car and started driving, gravel spitting behind me as I pulled away faster than I should have on the uneven road. The further I got from the campground, the easier it became to breathe. But as I reached the main road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. On the ridge above my campsite, in the full morning light, stood a figure. Small. Still. Staring down at the basin where I had been. I kept driving. I didn't slow down or look again. But I can't forget the feeling that hit me then, a cold certainty that whoever had circled my tent, examined my belongings, and stood in silence near my sleeping body had been there long before I arrived. And whatever they were doing with that squared-off patch of earth, it wasn't finished when I left. Just knowing I interrupted something has haunted me more than anything I actually saw. I still don't fully understand why I chose that lake in rural Montana, tucked far off the main highway, too quiet and too empty to feel welcoming. I had been driving north for hours, trying to outrun the noise of my life back in Billings, and when I saw the narrow dirt turnoff winding between tall pines, something in me insisted I should follow it. The road led to a small public campground beside a deep, still lake that looked black even under the afternoon sun. Only 2 sites existed there, and both were vacant, as if people passing through sensed something I didn't. I picked the one farther from the road, telling myself solitude was the point of the trip. The air felt damp and cool as I set up my tent. The lake barely rippled, reflecting the trees in a perfect dark mirror. For a moment, the stillness felt peaceful, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the silence was holding its breath. The woods pressed close around the water, the trunks rising in tight vertical lines, and the shadows between them looked too deep for midday. I'm not usually the type to get spooked by nature. I grew up hunting, fishing, hiking, but that place had a heaviness to it, a weight I couldn't identify. I walked down to the small wooden dock to watch the water. The boards were old but solid, though one near the edge had a long gouge carved into it, like someone had dragged something heavy across the surface. The indentation was deep enough to catch my toe as I stepped over it. I knelt and traced it with my fingers. The cut wasn't clean like a tool mark. It looked torn, scraped by something rough. I felt a strange chill and pulled my hand back, telling myself it was probably from someone's boat anchor. As dusk settled, the lake turned from black to a dull, metallic sheen. I cooked a small dinner on my camp stove, listening to the woods. The normal sounds were there, birds, rustling branches, insects, but they came in uneven bursts, like the forest kept falling silent for reasons I couldn't see. Every time it quieted, I felt the hair on my arms lift. When darkness finally closed in, I retreated to my tent earlier than usual. The lake at night looked too smooth, too motionless, reflecting nothing but a blank absence of light. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to faint water sloshes, even though the surface had been still all day. The sounds weren't rhythmic like waves. They came in slow, isolated movements, like something rising too close to the shoreline. I told myself fish were feeding near the bank. That explanation worked until the slosh became a dragging noise, something heavy shifting across shallow water, then stopping abruptly. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. Minutes passed. Nothing. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a dull thump near the dock. Not loud, but heavy. A sound made by weight, real weight, dropping onto wood. I sat up, heart kicking hard, listening. The woods were dead silent. I unzipped the tent slowly, just enough to see out. The lake was still visible through gaps in the trees, pale under the moon. The dock sat empty. I stared for what felt like 10 minutes straight, searching for movement. Nothing. No shape. No shadow. Just a faint wetness glistening on the boards, like something had recently climbed onto them. I closed the flap, trying to quiet my breathing. Eventually I managed a light, uneasy sleep. When dawn broke, I forced myself to walk to the dock. The wood was streaked with thin lines of lake water stretching from the edge all the way up to the gouged board. They looked too clean to be old. As I stood there studying them, I noticed something else. The water near the dock was cloudy, the lake bed disturbed as though something had pushed up through it. I decided I'd only stay one more night. Leaving immediately felt foolish. It was probably just animals, but I couldn't shake the thought of something heavier than a fish moving beneath the surface. I tried to distract myself by hiking a loop trail around the lake. The path was narrow, soft with pine needles, and the air smelled sharp and fresh. But halfway around, I noticed deep impressions in the dirt leading off the trail toward the water. They weren't paw prints, not boot prints either. They looked like long, uneven depressions dragging side by side, as if someone had walked with their legs bound or injured. I crouched over them, studying the pattern. The impressions led toward the lake and simply stopped at the edge. No splash marks, no disturbance, just ended, like the person, or whatever it was, had stepped straight into deep water and vanished. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled over the lake, muting everything into flat gray. I didn't light a fire, uneasy about drawing attention. I sat at the picnic table eating cold food, eyes drifting toward the dock every few seconds. The silence grew thicker as night fell. Even the insects seemed hesitant. When I finally lay down, I left the tent unzipped an inch, so I could hear more clearly. It didn't take long. First came a faint ripple, then another, then a long, steady movement like something gliding beneath the surface. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, approaching the shoreline with slow, deliberate surges. Then all at once it stopped. The lake went silent. I strained to hear anything, even a breath. Instead I heard the soft creak of wood bending. The dock. Something was standing on the dock. The boards groaned under shifting weight. Then a second creak. Then nothing. I stared at the tent ceiling, unable to blink. Minutes stretched. When the sound finally came, it was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. The faintest tap of something touching the ground near my campsite. Then another, light but controlled. Not footsteps exactly, more like careful placements of weight, spaced too far apart to be normal walking. My pulse hammered. I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. The tapping continued, circling slowly around the tent, pausing every few steps. At one point, the sound stopped so close I thought I could feel breath through the nylon. But there was no breathing sound, just presence. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the steps moved away. I stayed awake until the sun rose. When I stepped out of the tent, the ground around it was disturbed in long streaks, as if something had dragged itself through the dirt rather than walked. The marks led straight toward the dock, and when I followed them, I saw it immediately. The gouged board was deeper, fresh, as if weight had pressed down hard on it sometime before dawn. I left without packing properly, shoving everything into the back of my car in panicked handfuls. I didn't look toward the lake as I drove off, but a mile down the dirt road, curiosity made me glance in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, just barely visible between the trunks, was the dock, and on it stood a tall, dripping shape, still and facing the campsite I had just abandoned. I blinked, and it was gone, but the gouge in that board had been deepened by something, and whatever it was had finally learned exactly where my tent had been. I remember the exact moment the place felt wrong. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a cold prickle running across the back of my neck as I stepped out of my truck and looked at the tree line surrounding the Tennessee wildlife area I had chosen for a quiet weekend alone. It was late October, the air crisp, the leaves turning into piles of rust and gold. The campground was small and rarely used, tucked at the end of a narrow gravel road with only 3 designated sites. All of them were empty when I arrived, which should have made me happy. But instead, the emptiness felt staged, like someone had cleared out rather than simply not shown up. I set up my tent near the fire ring and walked the short path to a creek that ran along the back edge of the area. The water flowed softly, just enough to mask distant forest sounds. It seemed peaceful, safe, but even then I noticed how the mud along the bank had been disturbed as if someone had stood there for a long time. The prints were mostly washed out, but the pattern struck me. No shoe tread, just smooth oval depressions spaced strangely far apart. I told myself they were from someone wearing boots with worn soles, maybe a hunter scouting the area before dawn. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the temperature fell fast. I built a fire and watched the sky darken into a deep blue. The woods around me shifted from the usual chirping and rustling into long stretches of silence. A kind of heavy, expectant quiet that made me feel like I wasn't as alone as the empty campsite suggested. Every few minutes I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved. Everything looked normal. But that didn't calm me. It only made the feeling stronger. After eating, I took a small walk around the perimeter of the site. Near the far corner, close to a cluster of dense undergrowth, I found something odd. A torn strip of fabric tangled on a low branch. Dark green. Heavy material. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, frayed at one edge as if it had been ripped off during a struggle. I held it for a moment, feeling a strange chill. It smelled faintly of earth and old sweat, like it had been outside for weeks. I dropped it, telling myself hunters lost things all the time. but the unease grew thicker. By the time I crawled into my tent, the woods had gone completely still. Not one insect, not one breeze, just silence pressing against the nylon. I lay awake longer than I meant to, listening to the occasional crack of cooling branches far off in the distance. When I finally drifted into sleep, it was shallow and restless. The first sound that woke me was faint, a soft brushing noise, like someone dragging fingertips across the outside of the tent. I froze listening. The touch moved slowly along the back wall, paused, then continued toward the front. Too smooth to be an animal. Too careful. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it against the sleeping bag. The brushing stopped near the zipper entrance. I waited for breathing, footsteps, anything. Nothing came. After a minute that felt like 10, I heard slow steps moving away. Not into the forest. Around the tent. Circling. The ground was covered in leaves, so each step came with a soft crunch, spaced out as if whoever was there was trying to avoid making noise, but couldn't completely silence their weight. I didn't move. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I lay very still as the steps continued, never stopping long enough to suggest a person standing still, but never fading enough to suggest someone leaving. Just slow, deliberate pacing around the thin walls of my shelter. Eventually the sounds died away toward the creek. I waited nearly an hour before unzipping the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to faint orange coals. The woods looked empty, but the leaves around the tent were disturbed, dragged into thin streaks that traced a looping pattern around where I slept. No footprints. No clear track. Just the long, quiet evidence of someone standing too close for too long. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, the forest seemed normal again. Birds calling, breeze moving through the branches, sunlight filtering through the canopy. The contrast felt unreal. I walked to the creek to look for more signs and found something that chilled me even more. Across the shallow water, on the opposite bank, was a narrow trail of overturned leaves leading straight up into the trees. The path was perfectly straight, like someone had walked backward from the water, dragging their feet just enough to disturb the ground in a continuous line. I considered leaving immediately, but the sleep deprivation made me sluggish. I convinced myself it had been an animal, or maybe another camper passing through in the night. Still, I kept glancing around as I made breakfast, feeling eyes on me. I planned a short hike to clear my head, sticking to a marked trail nearby. A few minutes in, I found something that made me stop cold. A tree trunk had several long, shallow scrapes carved into it. Not claw marks, not tool marks. They were uneven, the kind made by something dull being dragged repeatedly at shoulder height. The bark around them was fresh, pale, exposed. Someone had done this recently, and repeatedly, like they were testing something, measuring something, or passing the time in a way I didn't want to understand. I turned back. The hike no longer felt like a good idea. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. I stayed close to the fire, even when the sun was still up. By dusk, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I would pack first thing in the morning and get out, but night fell too fast. I barely had time to put out the fire before the woods went unnaturally still again. The same silence as the night before, deep and heavy, as if the world was waiting for something. I sat inside the tent, listening, every muscle tight. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows through the thin fabric. Then I heard it, footsteps approaching through the leaves. Slow, steady, coming from the direction of the creek. I felt my lungs seize. The steps stopped just behind the tent. Too close, too controlled. Then came the faint sound of weight shifting on leaves, someone crouching. The silhouette pressed against the fabric, distorted by moonlight. A shape large enough that I could see the slope of shoulders. No inches of space between us. Just a thin sheet separating my body from whoever crouched outside. I didn't breathe. The shape stayed there for a long time, unmoving, watching. Waiting. Eventually it stood. Then it turned. Footsteps moved away, drifting into the woods. Slow at first, then quicker, then gone. At dawn, I threw everything into my truck without packing. As I pulled away, I glanced at the creek one last time. A figure stood in the trees on the opposite bank. Not moving, not hiding, just watching me leave. And right beside its feet, half buried in mud, was the missing upper portion of the torn green jacket sleeve I had found the day before. The rip matched perfectly. I still remember the night because of one simple thing. Nothing about it should have been strange. I'd run that stretch between Lubbock and Amarillo more times than I could count. A flat ribbon of lonely highway with nothing but fences, wheat fields, and the occasional dying gas station. Familiar, predictable, safe, in the way only a routine can make a place feel safe. But that night, something was waiting for me out there. Something patient. Something that knew the highway better than I did. I was hauling an empty refrigerated trailer back north, a deadhead run after a last-minute cancellation. My dispatcher told me to just get home, no pressure, no schedule. I should have felt relieved. Instead, the emptiness behind me made the whole rig feel lighter and twitchier than I liked, like it wanted to drift off the road with every gust. Around 1:45 a.m., I pulled into a tiny truck turnout, just a gravel patch and a flickering light pole to stretch my legs. The moon was bright enough that I didn't bother turning on my flashlight when I walked a lap around the trailer. That's when I noticed the dust. Boot prints. A whole trail of them. They led from the far edge of the pull-off straight to the back doors of my trailer. At first I laughed. Maybe some ranch kid, maybe some hitchhiker who'd wandered through earlier. But the thing that stopped me cold was the toe shape. Long, narrow, almost pointed. I told myself it was nothing, climbed back into the cab, and rolled out. 20 minutes later, I realized I wasn't alone. It started with a soft creak from behind me. Not loud, not sharp, just the subtle settling a loaded trailer might make. Except mine wasn't loaded. And empty trailers don't shift like something inside them is moving. I kept driving, focused straight ahead. A few miles later, another sound. This time it was a scrape, like metal on metal, coming from the upper right corner of the box. I reached for the CB and hesitated. Who was I going to call? What was I supposed to say? Hey, anyone out here hauling imaginary noises tonight? The third sound came about 10 miles past that. A hollow thud, like a fist hitting the wall. I jerked the wheel and nearly drifted onto the shoulder. Something was in my trailer. I pulled over fast, hazards flashing, adrenaline already burning up my nerves. I shoved the door open, jumped down, and walked toward the back of the rig. The wind was cutting across the plains hard enough to sting my eyes, and the temperature felt like it had dropped 10 degrees in minutes. Another thud came from inside. This one sharper, closer to the doors. I almost called the sheriff right then. But pride, stupidity, maybe exhaustion, something kept me from doing it. Instead, I climbed onto the rear step and grabbed the door latch. The metal was warm. That made no sense. The night was freezing, and that trailer had been empty all day. I hesitated, counted to 3. Then I yanked the right door open. The interior light flickered on automatically. The trailer was empty, totally and perfectly empty. But the air inside was warm, much warmer than outside, and thick, like someone had been breathing heavily in there for hours. I stepped inside, just one step, just enough to lean forward and sweep my flashlight beam from wall to wall. Nothing. I backed out, shut the door, and decided then and there I wasn't stopping again until I hit Amarillo. I didn't even make it 10 miles. The knocking came back. Only now it wasn't sporadic, it was steady, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers along the inside wall. 5 taps. Pause. 5 taps. Pause. I gripped the wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. Then the pattern changed. 5 taps. Pause. 4 taps. Pause. 3 taps. 2. 1. A single tap echoed through the cab. Then silence. I don't know why that was worse than the knocking. It felt like whatever was in my trailer had finished something. Like that countdown had meant something. Then my headlights flickered. Just one quick blink. Enough to throw the highway into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, I saw it, something in my driver's side mirror. A shape, pressed against the inside corner of the trailer's back wall. Just the faint outline of a head and shoulders. Unmoving. I stared so long I drifted over the lane line, and the rumble strip snapped me back. When I looked again, the shape was gone. I kept driving, refusing to look at the mirrors anymore. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow, my hands numb. The highway ahead looked endless. Then the weight shifted. I felt it through the frame. Something moved from the back of the trailer toward the front wall. Slow footsteps, one after another, heavy enough to jostle the cab slightly. My vision blurred. I don't know if it was fear or if I was actually starting to pass out. I slammed the truck onto the shoulder, gravel spraying, and jumped out without even setting the brake. I backed away, staring at the trailer like it might burst open. Nothing happened. Not a sound. Not a vibration. Not a thud. I forced myself to move. Forced myself to climb to the latch again. Forced myself to open the doors. Empty. But the warmth was stronger now. The air heavy and humid. And the smell like old earth. Like something that had been buried a long time. I closed the doors. Locked them. Climbed into the cab. Drove to the nearest truck stop without stopping again. When I backed into a parking space and opened the trailer for the third time, the air inside was cold. Normal. Dead empty. I reported the trailer as defective and refused to haul it again. They inspected it top to bottom. No animals. No intruders. No signs of forced entry. No source of heat. The mechanic joked that maybe I was just tired, but sometimes, when I'm running a lonely stretch of highway at night, I'll still hear it faintly in the back of my mind. 5 taps. Pause. 4. 3. 2. 1. And I swear, every time, I feel something warm breathing on the back of my neck. I remember the night by the color of the sky. It wasn't black, not really. It was this washed-out purple, the kind you get before a storm hits the flatlands. I was rolling east through Oklahoma, hauling a half-load of canned goods, nothing unusual. But from the minute I left the shipper, something felt off, like the road wanted me to turn around. I told myself I was just tired. I'd been running hard all week, trying to make up for a blown delivery window in Phoenix. A man can talk himself into almost anything when he needs the miles. About an hour after dark, the weather changed. The wind died completely. The air felt still, too still, the kind of quiet that sits in your ears and makes you feel like you're underwater. Even my engine sounded muted. And the highway, normally dotted with a few late-night travelers, was empty. No headlights behind me. No oncoming traffic. Nothing. Just me. And the sky that kept getting darker, even though there wasn't a cloud. I was passing a wide stretch of ranchland when my CB crackled. Not the usual static. This was sharp, like someone had brushed their thumb across the mic. I reached out, half expecting another driver to come on with a joke or some road update. But the only thing I heard was breathing. Slow. Unsteady. Human. I froze with my hand on the radio. Normally I'd chalk it up to interference, but then the breathing paused and a whisper pushed through the static. Is anyone awake out there? The voice wasn't quite right. Like someone trying to talk with their mouth half full. But it sounded close. Too close. I didn't respond. That's CB 101. You don't answer weird transmissions in the middle of nowhere unless you want trouble. The radio stayed silent after that, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Around midnight, I saw the sign for a rest area about 6 miles up. I decided to pull in, stretch, splash water on my face, and try to shake whatever mood had crawled under my skin. The rest area was empty when I rolled in. The lamps flickered like they were struggling for power. The vending machines hummed, but the building itself looked abandoned. No janitor's truck, no other rigs, not even a sedan. I killed the engine and stepped out into the thick, unmoving air. The silence pressed against me like weight. I walked over to the restroom building. The moment I touched the handle, something metallic thudded inside my trailer. Not the shifting of a load. Not the creak of suspension. A deliberate hit. I spun around, heart hammering. Another thud, this one louder, followed by a long dragging sound. There shouldn't have been anything in the trailer that could move, let alone drag. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and climbed up to the rear door. I swear my hand shook so badly I almost dropped the latch. I opened the left door. Empty. Just a metal box half full of canned goods, strapped and secured exactly like before. But the air inside wasn't still. It was warm and moving. Like someone had just exhaled. I flicked my flashlight across the floor and saw marks. Long streaks in the condensation. Not scratches, condensation trails. Like something had been pulled or had crawled across the floor. The streaks ended at the front wall of the trailer. I shut the door and backed away, every instinct screaming at me to get in the cab and get the hell out. Before I could move, my CB crackled again, loud enough I heard it from outside the truck. This time, the whisper was clearer. I found a warm place. Can you let me in? I didn't think. Didn't consider. I sprinted to the cab, locked the doors, and fired the engine. The lights flickered, every one of them, then steadied. I floored it out of the rest area, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. About a mile down the road, the weight shifted in the trailer. It was subtle at first, like someone taking a single step. Then another, and another, each one heavier, closer, like something was walking forward, pressing down through the frame. I kept the truck at 65, afraid to go slower, afraid to go faster. The footsteps stopped right behind the cab. Then something pressed against the front wall of the trailer. I felt it through the seat, one solid push. Not hard enough to break anything, but firm enough to know it wasn't my imagination. My radio hissed. Then, I'm cold. The voice was right behind me. Not through the CB. Not through the speaker. Behind the wall. I drove until I saw the glow of a pilot sign. I didn't slow down. Didn't signal. I just pulled in and parked crooked between two concrete barriers. I jumped out, ran to the back of the trailer, and yanked the doors open so fast I nearly fell. Cold air spilled out. Normal cold. Empty cold. The condensation streaks were gone. The load hadn't shifted at all. Nothing was there. I flagged down a worker inside and had him stand with me while I checked again. Still empty. Still normal. I slept inside the store that night, sitting upright in a corner chair like some paranoid drifter. In the morning, the sky was bright blue, the world normal again. I checked the CB. No strange transmissions. The trailer? Silent. But as I started the engine to finish the route, I noticed something on the inside of the driver's side window. A fog print. A handprint. Small. Narrow. And still warm enough to smear when I touched it. I never ran that route again. I still think about that trip more than I should. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping run in northern Arizona, something quiet to pull me out of the routine after weeks of long shifts at the warehouse. I picked a spot just outside Williams, far from the busier campgrounds, the kind of place where you hear every tree creak and every pine needle hit the ground. I'd been there once before, years ago, and I remembered it as peaceful. I remembered it as safe. I guess that's the problem with memories. They fool you into thinking a place can't change, or that people don't. The first night was uneventful, a little chilly but calm. The fire crackled low and steady. I cooked a can of chili, listened to the muted hum of the forest, and fell asleep to the soft rustle of branches brushing against one another. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard footsteps in the brush, but when I stepped out of the tent, the woods were still. The moonlight spilled over everything like thin silver paint. Nothing moved. No sound. No wind. I convinced myself it was a deer and went back to sleep. The next morning I drove into town to restock water and buy a new lighter. My old one had run out faster than I expected. When I got back to camp, I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. Pine needles had been pushed aside in a shape too precise to be natural. A long dragline, like someone had pulled something heavy across the ground. Maybe a cooler, maybe a tarp. I tried to write it off as my own gear from the night before, but something about the pattern felt wrong. Too straight. Too intentional. I brushed it away with my boot and tried not to think about it. Later that afternoon the wind started picking up, cold and dry. The forest around me rattled with moving branches. I sat by the fire pit prepping dinner when I caught a flicker of movement on the treeline. Not an animal darting. Not a shadow trick of the wind. More like someone standing just behind a narrow cluster of pines. I looked hard, long enough for my eyes to burn, but nothing moved after that. The silence settled again, heavier than before. I reminded myself that people wander these forests all the time, and maybe someone had wandered too close, realized the camp was occupied, and slipped away to avoid awkward conversation. But the feeling in my chest didn't buy that explanation. It stayed tight, wound like a knot, buzzing every time the wind changed direction. Around sunset, I walked about 50 yards out to collect more firewood. I remember crouching to pick up a fallen branch when I heard the unmistakable crack of something stepping on dry twigs behind me. Not close. Not far. Just far enough that I couldn't see who or what it was when I turned. I stood there, holding the branch like it offered protection, staring into the dimming trees. My pulse thudded behind my ears. The woods were darkening fast, taking on that murky blue color that makes everything look deeper and more crowded. I hated how quiet everything was, how nothing moved after that single crack. I didn't call out, didn't want to. I just backed up slowly until I could see my tent again through the trees, then turned and walked briskly the rest of the way. Dinner tasted metallic from the nerves. I ate quickly, extinguished the fire before it was fully dark, and sat inside the tent for a while, pretending to read. But my eyes kept drifting to the mesh screen. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every snapping branch felt like a signal. Around 9 I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it tight, and told myself I was imagining things. I fell asleep eventually, but not deeply. Every sound yanked me halfway awake. At some point, maybe near midnight, a new noise drifted in. A slow, steady scraping. Not loud enough to be a branch dragged by wind. Not random enough to be an animal. It sounded like someone running a stick along the outside of the tent. Just once. Then again. Slow. Intentional. I froze inside the sleeping bag. My breath hitched. The scraping continued along the right side, then stopped at the front corner. Silence followed, the kind of silence that makes your skin feel 2 sizes too small. I knew someone was out there. I felt it the same way you feel someone standing behind you before you turn. I didn't move for nearly 20 minutes. My legs cramped. My jaw locked so tight my teeth hurt. Eventually the scraping didn't come back, and no footsteps followed. But the quiet didn't feel safe. It felt like waiting. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the bag and sit up, my hands were shaking so badly I could hear the nylon tremble. I counted to 50, then listened again. Nothing. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The clearing was empty, but the dirt right outside my tent flap had a new mark in it. A single line, curved slightly, like someone had dragged the tip of a boot around the entrance. I stared at it for a long time, trying not to panic, trying not to think about someone kneeling right there, inches from where I slept. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally scraped across the sky, pale and cold, I stepped out into the clearing with a stiffness that came from hours of fear. I walked the perimeter of the campsite, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Shoe prints. Thin soles. Maybe running shoes. They circled the camp in a wide arc, then cut in closer, passing behind the fire pit, around the back of the tent, and disappearing into the tree line behind a cluster of pines. They weren't mine. They were too small. Too narrow. Too many. At least 5 or 6 full loops around the clearing. I packed fast. Every zipper sounded like it echoed for miles. I threw everything into the back of the SUV with no real order, just urgency. When I took down the tent, I noticed something on the back side of the canvas near the ground. A smear. Light, dry brownish. Dirt maybe, or old blood. I didn't stop to inspect it. As I was loading the last bag, I heard movement again. Not distant this time. Directly ahead of me, somewhere in the cluster of trees I had seen movement the previous afternoon. A single heavy step. Then another. Nothing rushed. Nothing hid. Whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I slammed the tailgate shut and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors before the engine even started. My hands slipped on the wheel from sweat. Branches whipped the sides of the SUV as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if someone stepped out into the clearing as I left. I just drove until the forest thinned and the highway appeared like a lifeline. I reached a gas station outside Flagstaff around mid-morning. I went inside, bought coffee I didn't drink, and sat in the parking lot trying to calm down. I told myself I was safe now. I told myself it was over. But when I finally looked at the SUV's passenger side windows, I saw it. Something faint. Something smeared by fingertips. Not words. Not symbols. Just marks. Light streaks, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass, slid downward, and walked away. The angle of the marks told me one thing. They were made while I was still in the woods. While I was packing. While I thought I was alone.